The sun rose weakly over the small village, casting a pale orange glow on the worn cobblestone streets. In one of the dimly lit houses at the edge of town, a young woman sat on a splintered wooden chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Her parents stood before her, their faces tight with false sympathy, voices wavering with rehearsed excuses. "It's for the best," her mother said, her lips quivering as though she, too, believed the lie. Her father, a man whose eyes had long lost warmth, added nothing, simply crossing his arms and nodding toward the door, the finality in his gesture heavier than any words could be. She had been their only daughter, yet now, at 21, she was considered worthless, because her body had failed to meet their impossible expectations. Their wealth could buy comfort, luxury, and influence, but it could not conceal their cruel obsession with inheritance and bloodlines. She had never felt more isolated, more abandoned. Her mind raced, trying to imagine what awaited her outside the walls she had known since childhood. She thought of the open fields, the forested hills that loomed beyond the village, and the strangers who might pass her life by without a second glance. They handed her over as if she were an object, a piece of furniture that no longer had use. There were no farewells that mattered, no whispered assurances that she might find happiness elsewhere. Her parents' eyes avoided hers, a reflection of the shame they placed entirely on her. They had whispered to the merchant who arrived that morning, a man who had an odd way of speaking, soft and persuasive, as though they were negotiating the sale of livestock rather than their own daughter. The transaction was brief, the contracts signed with ink and cold indifference, sealing her fate. She tried to speak, to plead, to argue, but her voice seemed to vanish before it could reach them. She was moved from the only home she had ever known, forced onto a wagon that smelled of leather and hay, the wheels creaking under the weight of her fear. The villagers whispered behind their hands, some with pity, others with judgment, as if this were simply the natural order of things, the punishment for being what she could not control. The forest approached gradually, its dense canopy of pines and oaks offering both refuge and menace. Each gust of wind carried the scent of damp earth, moss, and pine resin, unfamiliar and strangely comforting. She wondered if the people she would meet here would see her as more than a commodity, as more than someone defined by her inability to bear children. And yet, even as the fear clawed at her chest, there was a spark of defiance, quiet and trembling, but present. She refused to collapse completely, to let the cruelty of others define the totality of her existence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound carrying through the trees like a lonely herald. She imagined the life of whoever lived out here, and a glimmer of hope began to form, fragile but undeniable. The wagon stopped in front of a modest cabin, weathered by storms and years of neglect, but alive with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A man stepped forward, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused from labor, eyes shaded with weariness yet softened by an unspoken gentleness. For children clung to his legs, curious and wary, peeking from behind the protective barrier of their father. They studied her, their eyes wide, unjudging, innocent in a way that she had forgotten existed. The man's voice was steady and calm as he greeted her, and though he knew nothing of her past, there was no condemnation in his tone. He introduced himself simply, as though the very act of naming was a bridge between worlds she had thought forever closed to her. She noticed the children's ragged clothing, the dirt-streaked faces, the subtle laughter that hinted at resilience despite hardship. The man asked no questions about her family, her worth, or her fertility. Instead, he offered her a meal, a place by the fire, and the kind of acceptance that seemed alien yet profoundly necessary. As night fell, the forest exhaled a deep, almost sentient hush, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the quiet murmur of the children drifting to sleep. She felt the tension in her shoulders slowly ease, the tightness in her chest loosening, just a little. Here, there were no expectations rooted in cruelty, no demand for her to be anything other than herself. The stars appeared one by one through the clearing above, distant but steadfast, like silent witnesses to the quiet revolution of her life. She wondered if perhaps this was how life was meant to be lived, not as a pawn in the games of others, but as a participant in the humble, messy, unpredictable rhythm of love and family. She could not know yet how much joy this life would bring her, nor how profound her connection to these people would become, but she felt it, a subtle vibration beneath her ribs, the first real pulse of possibility in a long time. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by the limitations imposed upon her, but by the choices she might make with courage, with trust, and perhaps, eventually, with love. The wagon rumbled over uneven forest paths, each jolt making her heart leap in a mixture of fear and strange anticipation. The scent of pine resin and damp earth filling her senses, foreign yet comforting, and as the village receded behind her, swallowed by morning mist, she realized that the life she had known, the harsh judgments, the cold expectations, the constant pressure to conform to her parents' idea of worth, was gone, and in its place stretched an unknown wilderness, both terrifying and full of possibility. She watched the trees blur past, massive oaks and pines standing like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind as though nodding in cautious welcome, and she imagined the people who might live among them, wondering if they would see her as she truly was, not merely as a commodity defined by what she could or could not give. And when the wagon finally stopped before a small cabin, rough-hewn from weathered logs, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney, she felt her chest tighten with a strange mix of dread and hope, for the man who stepped forward from the shadows of the porch was broad-shouldered, hands calloused and strong. Yet his expression carried no judgment, only a quiet curiosity and a softness that made her feel, for the first time in years, that perhaps she might belong somewhere, that perhaps the world still held people capable of seeing her as human rather than as property. And the 4 children who peered from behind his legs, eyes wide, faces smudged with dirt, hair tangled but shining in the weak sunlight, studied her with a mixture of caution and fascination, a gaze unspoiled by the cruelty she had grown accustomed to, and the father, sensing her hesitation, simply smiled and spoke in a steady voice, introducing himself and his children, offering her warmth, food, and a place by the fire, and he asked no questions about her past, her family, or the reasons she had been sent away. Instead, he treated her as an equal, as a person worthy of dignity and respect, and she felt something shift within her, a subtle, almost imperceptible loosening of the tight coil of fear that had bound her for so long, and as she entered the cabin, her eyes taking in the modest furnishings. A sturdy wooden table scarred by years of use, a few mismatched chairs, a quilt draped over the back of a bench. She realized that although this home lacked the wealth and luxury she had been raised around, it radiated a warmth and life that the grandest house in the village could never offer, and when she sat down to the simple meal of bread, stew, and fresh milk, the children slowly gathered around her, shy at first, asking tentative questions, voices soft yet full of curiosity, and she answered them cautiously, unsure of how to act, how to claim this fragile place in their lives without overstepping boundaries she had never been taught to respect. And yet, as the meal progressed, laughter began to creep into the corners of the room, subtle at first, then stronger, until it filled the cabin like sunlight spilling into dark corners, and she realized that she had not felt this alive in years, that the sound of joy, of innocence untouched by cruelty, was like a balm to her weary soul, soothing the rawness left by her parents' betrayal. And she watched the eldest child, a boy with a shock of unruly hair, show a younger sibling how to balance a spoon on the edge of the bowl, and she smiled despite herself, a flicker of real happiness igniting in her chest, small but undeniable, and she felt the father's gaze on her. Not invasive, not judging, simply observing, protective and steady, and she knew he saw her not as someone broken or defined by her inability to conform to society's expectations, but as someone capable of contributing, of belonging, of being part of this imperfect, messy, beautiful little family. And as the day wore on, she began to explore the cabin and its surroundings, the children trailing behind, her with quiet fascination, asking questions about her clothes, her past, and the village she had left, and she answered in measured tones, careful not to overwhelm them with the pain she carried, yet allowing glimpses of herself to emerge, small pieces of the person she had once been, pieces she had thought lost forever. And as evening descended, painting the sky with streaks of purple and gold, she helped the children gather firewood, her hands trembling from exertion but also from the thrill of feeling useful, of being needed, of being chosen not for what she lacked but for what she could offer. And when they returned to the cabin, the fire crackling and casting dancing shadows across the walls, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, the beginnings of trust, of hope, of a sense that maybe, just maybe, life could still hold something beautiful for her, that she might belong somewhere, that she might be loved for who she was rather than what she could provide. And as she tucked the youngest into bed, listening to their quiet breathing and soft murmurs, she realized that the fear that had dominated her life, the fear of rejection, of abandonment, of worthlessness, was beginning to loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of possibility, a realization that she had been given a chance to start over, to rewrite the story of her life not as a commodity, not as someone discarded, but as a person capable of love, of connection, of building a life with people who valued her presence simply because she existed. And as she lay awake that night, the cabin quiet except for the soft breathing of the children and the distant whisper of wine through the trees, she let herself imagine a future she had thought impossible, a future where she might be happy, where she might belong, where she might matter, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that maybe, just maybe, she could finally breathe. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the forest and the cabin settled into her bones like a heartbeat she had almost forgotten existed, each morning greeting her with the smell of pine and damp earth, the laughter of children echoing through the trees, and the quiet strength of the man who had taken her in without question, who never asked for justification or explanation, only offered kindness and stability. And as she moved through the routines of this new life, preparing meals, mending clothes, gathering firewood, teaching the children to read, laugh, and navigate the small wonders of the woods, she felt herself growing into someone she scarcely recognized, someone stronger, gentler, and unafraid to care, to nurture, to be needed, and in the process, she discovered a reservoir of resilience she had not known existed, a capacity for love and connection that defied the cruelty of her past. And the children responded to her in ways that slowly unraveled the deepest knots of her fear, trusting her with secrets, with laughter, with tears, and sometimes, in the quiet moments just after dusk, they would cluster around the fire as she told them stories of far-off places, of adventures and wonders, and she realized that she was building something precious, something permanent, not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by devotion, by the sheer act of showing up and being present in their lives. And the man watched these interactions with a quiet pride, sometimes stepping back to allow her space, sometimes offering a gentle word or a hand when needed. And in his presence, she felt safe in a way that she had never known, safe enough to allow hope to bloom within her chest, tentative yet insistent. And over time, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, replaced by the warmth of belonging and the unspoken promise of family. And she caught herself smiling at the smallest moments, the way the youngest child would curl into her lap as she read, the way the eldest would proudly show off a carved toy, the way the man would glance at her across the room with a softness in his eyes that made her stomach flutter in a way she had thought impossible. And she began to see the contours of a life she could claim as her own, one where she was valued not for her ability to meet someone else's expectations, but simply for being herself, whole and imperfect. And the forest, once a looming unknown, became a sanctuary, each path familiar, each tree a companion, each breeze a whisper of encouragement. And she realized that she was no longer running from her past but moving towards something brighter, something she had never dared imagine. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, the man invited her to walk with him to the edge of the clearing, the children trailing behind, laughter and whispers of curiosity filling the cool evening air. And he spoke softly of his life, of the struggles of raising for children alone, of the loneliness that had defined his days before she arrived, and of how her presence had changed everything, had breathed life into the cabin and hearts alike. And she felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and an unspoken love that had grown quietly but insistently in the shared silence, in the shared work, in the shared moments of vulnerability and trust. And she realized that she, too, had changed him, had given him a sense of hope and joy that he had not known for years. And the children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, leaned into her hand, small fingers clutching hers as if to anchor her to the reality of this new, beautiful life. And as they stood together at the edge of the forest, the wind carrying the scent of pine and soil, she understood that she had finally found a place where she mattered, where she was not defined by her failures or what she could not give, but celebrated for her courage, her heart, her presence, and in that moment, the man turned to her, eyes meeting hers, and without words, they acknowledged the bond that had grown between them, a bond built on trust, respect, and shared resilience, and she felt a lightness she had never known, a freedom that had nothing to do with escape and everything to do with acceptance. And as night fell, the cabin glowing warmly behind them, the children sleepy and content, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with laughter, love, and the kind of quiet happiness she had only ever dreamed of, knowing that she had found a family not by blood but by heart. And she understood that the scars of her past, pain, betrayal, abandonment, would never completely fade. Yet they no longer defined her, no longer held power over the life she was building here. And as she lay that night by the fire, listening to the gentle breathing of the children and the distant whisper of wind through the trees, she allowed herself to dream without fear, to hope without restraint, to embrace a life rich with meaning. And she felt a deep, unwavering certainty that she would never again be abandoned, never again be judged by what she lacked, and that in the quiet, imperfect, and profoundly human rhythms of love, work, and shared life, she had finally, truly found a home, a place where she belonged, a life worth living, and a heart ready to love and be loved in return.